Hi everyone. In this lecture we're going to spend a few minutes talking about sort of how we officially define poverty and really how the government thinks about poverty. How the government thinks about poverty and sort of by extension how we think about poverty formally as a society is sort of a really important part of how we formulate a response to it. So some people, for instance, let me just advance my slide here. Some people, for instance, really identify poverty as a personal issue. We've seen this, there's a historical precedent for this. We've seen in Elizabethan England and colonial times that it really was up to the individual to take care of themselves. In instances where the individual couldn't care for themselves, it was up to his or her family, or maybe a church, or maybe the local community to care for that person. Oftentimes, when we think about poverty as a personal problem, we think that poverty is a temporary problem, so it's time limited. And again, we saw this reflected in sort of Elizabethan England when people would sort of cycle through almshouses or something like that. Other people contend that poverty really is a persistent issue. And that sort of justification, for some kind of social welfare response to poverty spearheaded by the government. Now, these aren't the only two, believe it or not, these aren't the only two definitions of poverty. There are actually some others, and that's sort of what we're going to talk about here next. Let me advance the slide. So another way to think about poverty is really about this idea of deprivation. And that's actually what poverty means. So poverty means a lack of or a deprivation. So people can have a poverty of lots of things. But oftentimes poverty means the deprivation of food, or the absence of food, or the absence of housing or clothing or medical care, or maybe a combination of these things, all of which are sort of required to maintain some kind of decent standard of living. Some people, although it's not on this slide, I realize, but some people would say that the deprivation of education or the deprivation of sort of a community or a group of people that love and care for you is would sort of count as poverty. And so that way people who tend to think about poverty as a form of deprivation tend to really root their arguments in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the official federal definition of poverty are actually based on this idea about what's known as absolute poverty. On the previous slide, I'm actually just going to go back for just a second. When we think about poverty as a form of deprivation, this is actually a form of thinking about poverty as a relative form of poverty. So people have they're deprived, or they have a level of food that is inadequate relative to other people. They have a poverty of housing that is relative to other people. On the other hand, an absolute, let me just advance my slide again, an absolute definition of poverty basically means that someone is considered impoverished if they're below a certain threshold. Now, most of us have probably heard that there's an official poverty line. I just looked it up, and I have to refer to my notes here. But the 2019 Federal Poverty Guideline for the lower 48 for a family of four is $25,750. Again, this is for a family of four, so it would be less if a family is smaller than four people. It would be more if a family is larger than four people. So what we're saying here is this is an absolute definition, right? So if you fall below that, you're considered impoverished, and again, that's relative to a standard. But that absolute standard of poverty is applied whether or not someone lives in a high cost of living area, like, say, Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. or New York City, or a low cost of living area, like some places in upstate New York, or some parts of Pennsylvania, or parts of the Midwest, or something like that. Now, there are different absolute poverty standards for Alaska and Hawaii. You're welcome. In fact, I encourage you to look them up. But again, the idea here is that when we think about absolute poverty, it's really there's a sort of bright line in the sand, and if you're on one side of it, you're not in poverty. If you're on the other side of it, you are in poverty. Now, there are two other, I'm going to say that again because there was a little glitch in my recording. So there are sort of these two other ways to think about poverty, and they're listed here. The supplemental poverty measure and the self-sufficiency standard. The supplemental poverty measure is actually a program of the U.S. Census, and what it does is it takes into account benefits that a family or a person may get from the government. The self-sufficiency standard is actually calculated for all of the 50 states. You can look up what the self-sufficiency standard is in your state. But it's a way to think about sort of poverty from a budgetary standpoint. So what are the needs of a family, and how much money does it take to sort of satisfy those needs? So what it acknowledges, quite frankly, is that different families are going to have different needs and thus require different levels of income to sort of either be in poverty or out of poverty. The federal poverty line that standard, although it's revised periodically, it was established in the 60s, and so it's really criticized as being fairly dated and sort of not sensitive to the sort of contours of the modern marketplace, right? So the fact that cities are more expensive than urban areas, cities are more expensive than rural areas, and that even people have sort of different needs. So these measures, like the supplemental poverty measure and the self-sufficiency standard, are an attempt to bridge the sort of absolute poverty measure and the relative poverty measure that we discussed in the previous slide. Their attempt to sort of merge those two ways of thinking about poverty. So some of the other material for this week, I think, does a better job of explaining who is poor than this slide does. But in terms of absolute numbers, typically there are more whites that are poor than blacks. However, when considered as a proportion of the population, African Americans about 3 times as likely to be as poor relative to whites. Single-parent households have high poverty, and that's probably a function of the absolute, this definition of that relies on an absolute conceptualization of poverty. Since like 2008 or so, childhood poverty has been increasing, but the poverty among the elderly has been decreasing, and that's largely a function of changes in where government has shifted its attention. And then, in general, the more education a person seeks, the less likely they are, or the less severe they are, severely they'll experience poverty. Moving on, poverty is, especially in the U.S., extraordinarily persistent. That sort of intergenerational transmission of poverty happens in about 50% of cases. And the most common reason for people to become impoverished or sort of enter poverty is job loss. Some of the other videos for this week talk about sort of the harmful effects of losing a job, and that's partially a function of the relatively low savings rate of Americans. That is talked about in some of the other material this week. Gabler, for example, talks about how difficult it would be for people to come up with $2,000 in 30 days. So that $2,000 that he's talking about, for instance, might cover the cost of, rent and food for a couple of months during a period of job loss or, short-term unemployment. It might also cover, a really expensive car repair bill or something like that. And again, what his stuff really highlights is how, how much on a sort of razor's edge people are walking, and the sort of risks associated with not having significant savings. Minority statuses such as race, young, and then female, typically is associated with the greatest risk of entering poverty and also the smallest risk of exiting. And as with other things that we talk about as social workers, when a person has a combination of minority statuses like this, the risks are sort of compounded. So there's actually a number of explanations for why poverty continues to sort of plague us as a nation, and then why it sort of continues to plague people. And some people think about it as a lack of human capital. Human capital really is this idea that people can gain things through their connections to others. So, for example, if you have human capital, you might be able to secure a job. And of course, securing a job would be one way to escape poverty. You also, if a person has connections to others, they can secure other things that they need to help them sort of fulfill their obligations as people and as workers and as family members and things like that. But obviously, if you don't have those connections, you're unable to sort of meet your needs, which results in sort of poverty, especially from the deprivation standpoint that we talked about a couple of slides ago. Other people like to talk about this idea of a culture of poverty, and that's that people teach each other how to be poor. They learn how to live off of this system. That is actually a sort of a callback to this idea that we've talked about in other weeks, which is dependency, right? So poverty and poverty really is the result of dependency on the system, and people are poor precisely because of programs that are supposed to help lift them out of poverty. Let me pause here for a second. Which of these explanations you personally want to subscribe to is completely up to you. These are really just explanations. My own sense is that there's a combination of a lot of things going on, and so to sort of continue through this list, some people think about poverty as lights just turned back in my office. Some people think about poverty really as a form of exploitation, right? People are poor because other people are taking a larger share of the resources than what they're entitled to, or people are poor because they're not paid wages that are commensurate with the work that they're doing. And still other people think about poverty from a structural perspective, which suggests that there are sort of these social structures that exist that make people poor. In some ways, education is part of a structural explanation of poverty. If people don't have access to education, they don't have the ability to learn the skills that would help them get jobs and lift themselves out of poverty. If people don't have access to health care, right, they live in sort of a healthcare desert or a place where they're sort of limited or only access to low quality health care. It would be these things that are sort of keeping them in poverty. Now, each of these explanations is important because each of these explanations helps identify a path, right? It helps identify a solution to how we think about poverty, and that's what some of the other material talks about this week and in future weeks. All right, if you have any questions, you're always welcome to post online, or feel free to get in touch. Thanks for watching.